A sleek black car gets pulled over in the middle of a Lexington street. And the reason? Simply because the driver is a black woman named Jasmine Crockett. Within just 3 minutes, she's searched, dragged out of the vehicle, and a mysterious bag of white powder appears under her seat. What Lieutenant Frank Wallace doesn't know is this. The woman he's trying to frame is far from ordinary. But when the truth finally surfaces, who will be exposed and who will have the courage to speak up? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Lexington, Kentucky, basked in the orange hue of sunset. The upscale neighborhood looked quiet, too quiet. Lawns were trimmed, fences polished, windows shut tight like secrets. A patrol cruiser sat parked under a fading sycamore tree. Inside, Lieutenant Frank Wallace watched the road like a hawk. 20 years in, and all he saw now were threats. His jaw clenched, fingers tapping the steering wheel. Beside him, Rookie Officer Daniel stayed silent, eyes flicking between his notes and the world outside, unsure which one made less sense. The air inside the car was tense, heavy with something unspoken. Frank wasn't here to keep the peace. He was hunting. And that's when she appeared, silent, poised, and marked for judgment. The black Mercedes S-Class emerged from the bend in the road like a specter gliding through smoke. Its paint gleamed under the fading sun like polished obsidian, the kind of vehicle that didn't belong to just anyone. Every line of its design spoke of money, refinement, and power. But what caught Lieutenant Frank Wallace's attention wasn't the car. It was the woman behind the wheel. She was black, mid-40s, dressed in a deep navy suit tailored with absolute precision. Her hair was swept back into a sleek bun, face framed by sharp cheekbones and a calm, collected expression. Her gaze never flickered toward the patrol car. She didn't brake, didn't hesitate. She simply drove. She wasn't arrogant. She was confident. And that confidence was exactly what made Frank's knuckles tighten around the steering wheel. To a man like him, authority worn by a woman like her was a challenge, not a coincidence. His tone dropped low, bitter and sharp like rusted metal. Mercedes like that, he muttered, not taking his eyes off the car. Woman like her, it never adds up. Trust me. His words weren't about suspicion. They were a verdict, already passed. Bet it's leased, probably paid for by someone else, or stolen. It wasn't just profiling, it was poison he'd practiced. Daniel turned his head, glancing at Frank with a flicker of unease. She didn't break any laws, Lieutenant, he said, careful but firm. So what? Frank growled. She's trying too hard to look clean. That's always a sign. The rookie looked back out the window, trying to shake the chill crawling down his spine. The woman hadn't done anything wrong, but Frank didn't see a citizen. He saw a target wrapped in elegance, and that was all the reason he needed. And just like that, judgment turned into action, with no law broken, no warning given. The siren remained silent, but the red and blue lights began to pulse against the back of the sleek Mercedes like a silent alarm. It was the kind of stop that didn't announce danger. It created it. Jasmine Crockett noticed the lights in her rearview mirror and responded with the ease of someone who'd done this before. She didn't slam on the brakes, didn't swerve. She eased to the curb with quiet precision, flipped on her signal, and coasted into a perfect park alongside the sidewalk. Her hands stayed at 10 and 2, her movements fluid and controlled, like she'd memorized this performance. Not for safety, but for survival. Inside the patrol car, Daniel's forehead creased. She didn't do anything, he said quietly, almost to himself. Frank gave a dry laugh, low and mean. They never do, until they do, he muttered, throwing the cruiser into park. Trouble always smells the same. He opened his door and stepped out, already walking like he owned the outcome. Daniel hesitated for half a second before following, unease crawling under his skin like static. As they approached, Jasmine lowered her window halfway, posture steady. No fear in her eyes, just practiced calm, like someone who knew that fear could be misread, used against her. Good evening, officer, she said evenly. Is there a reason I was pulled over? Her voice was soft, but there was steel in it, a quiet resistance woven through every syllable. Frank didn't answer the question. He just stared at her for a beat too long before snapping, License and registration. Jasmine nodded once, saying nothing, and reached, slowly, deliberately, for the glove compartment. She moved like a surgeon, every gesture visible, every choice calculated. Her license, registration, and insurance were all handed over together, neat and current. Daniel took mental note. There were no violations, no signs of impairment, no cause. And yet the temperature between them dropped. Frank flipped through her documents with exaggerated scrutiny, eyebrows raised, lip curled. "Nice car," he said flatly. "You rent it, or someone let you borrow it?" Jasmine blinked once, still holding his gaze. "It's mine," she replied, tone even. "I bought it last year." Frank snorted. "Right. You live around here?" Jasmine hesitated a breath, not from guilt, but from recognition. She knew where this was going. "I don't see how that's relevant, officer," she replied, voice tight. Frank leaned in, his face inches from hers, shadow spilling into the car. "I'll decide what's relevant. Answer the question." Behind him, Daniel shifted uncomfortably, glancing around. Cars passed, pedestrians glanced but didn't stop. No one interfered. And then, the moment turned, subtle tensions snapped into open aggression. Frank's voice, already laced with hostility, hardened into a command that brooked no discussion. "Step out of the vehicle," he said, louder now, every syllable punctuated with force. He wasn't asking. He wasn't explaining. He was asserting control, because to him, authority didn't need reason, only compliance. Jasmine blinked slowly, steadying herself, eyes still fixed on him. "Officer," she said evenly, "I've complied fully. I've broken no laws. Am I under arrest?" Her voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge beneath the surface. Not fear, but defiance born of experience. Frank didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, his shadow falling across her lap like a curtain closing on dignity. His fingers brushed against the butt of his sidearm, not drawing it, but letting her see that he could. Jasmine glanced at the gesture, then looked back at him with deliberate slowness, unblinking. "I'm not resisting," she added, "but I will not be treated like a threat without cause." Daniel shifted on his feet behind them, tension buzzing in his chest like an electric wire about to snap. With a dramatic sigh, Jasmine reached across her body, unbuckled her seatbelt, and opened the car door. Her movements were precise, practiced, the choreography of someone who knew that any sudden motion could be twisted into a justification for violence. She stepped out, her heels clicking softly against the asphalt, and stood tall, her presence commanding even in the face of humiliation. But Frank wasn't finished. Without asking, without even a pause, he reached into the car and grabbed her handbag from the passenger seat. "What's in here, huh?" he snapped, already digging into it. Jasmine's expression changed, but she didn't flinch. "You do not have my consent to search my belongings," she said, voice low and cutting. "That's a violation of my rights." Frank didn't respond. He ripped open the flap and violently dumped the contents onto the hood of her car. Her phone bounced once before landing face down. A slim notepad slid across the metal and nearly fell to the pavement. A small gold pen, a lipstick tube, and a leather wallet scattered like debris from a wreck. Daniel stood frozen, watching the scene unfold like a slow-motion car crash. None of this was standard. None of it was legal. But the worst part wasn't the silence. It was the normalcy in how Frank moved, how easily he turned a routine stop into a spectacle. Jasmine, still composed, stepped forward and began calmly gathering her belongings. "There is nothing suspicious here. There never was," she said, each word precise like a courtroom statement. But Frank stepped closer, towering over her, voice lowered to a growl. "People like you always have something to hide," he hissed. It wasn't policing. It was personal. It was power used like a weapon. And Jasmine, standing firm in the middle of the street, knew exactly what she was up against. Not just one man, but a system that gave him permission to believe she didn't belong. And just when it seemed the humiliation was over, Frank crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The last item Jasmine retrieved from the hood of her car, a slim leather notepad, was still in her hand when Frank turned his back to her and walked toward the open driver's side door. His steps weren't rushed, but they weren't routine either. They carried the practiced ease of a man who'd done this before and never been questioned. Daniel noticed it immediately. The unnatural calm, the tight movement of Frank's right shoulder as he slipped one hand inside his jacket. Daniel's training told him to observe the small things, the gestures that reveal intent when words don't. And this was wrong. Too deliberate, too rehearsed. Frank's hand emerged holding something small, semi-transparent, reflective. A plastic bag. It was sealed tight, folded, controlled. Daniel's eyes locked on it. It hadn't come from Jasmine. It hadn't fallen from her purse. It hadn't been on the hood, the seat, or the ground. Frank had it on him. And now, like a magician preparing the final step of a trick, Frank leaned into the car with a subtle dip of the shoulder, gone for barely 2 seconds. When he stood up again, the bag was gone. Daniel's heart stopped. Not slowed, stopped. The world didn't blur or spin, it just fell silent, as if the street itself was holding its breath. Frank dusted off his vest like nothing had happened. His face morphed into a picture of manufactured surprise. He raised his voice with the smooth confidence of a man who'd done this dance before. "Well, well," he said, drawing out the words like a showman unveiling a final act. "Looks like we've got ourselves a little situation." His tone was laced with false concern, but Daniel could hear it for what it was, a script. Frank dipped back into the car again, this time making a show of it. "What do we have here?" he said louder, his voice meant to carry. Then he emerged, holding the plastic bag like it had appeared from thin air, pinched delicately between 2 fingers. The contents were unmistakable. A white powder, neatly packed, the kind used too often in headlines to destroy lives. Daniel's stomach turned. He felt bile rising in his throat, but he didn't move. Couldn't. All around them, the sidewalk had shifted. Phones were out. Eyes were watching. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd, just loud enough to register. Jasmine stood frozen, her back straight, her eyes locked on Frank. But she wasn't confused. She wasn't surprised. She was tired. And underneath the calm on her face was something deeper, something carved from years of seeing this play out, of watching good men say nothing while bad ones rewrote reality in real time. She had seen this before. Too many had. This wasn't about law. This wasn't about drugs. This was about power, about the story Frank wanted to tell, and how easily he could tell it. Jasmine took one step forward. Her voice rang clear, slicing through the growing crowd like a razor. "That's not mine," she said, loud enough for the phones, the bystanders, the world. There was no panic in her tone, no desperation, just a steady, defiant truth. "You planted that." Frank didn't miss a beat. He gave a dry laugh, sarcastic and loud enough to cover the weight of her words. "Sure, lady," he said with a smirk. "That's what they all say." Then slowly he turned toward Daniel, his partner, his junior, his shield. His eyes narrowed just slightly. He raised his brows as if asking, "You've got my back, right?" The unspoken pressure between them was suffocating, but Daniel didn't respond. His mouth felt dry. His thoughts raced. He had seen everything, clearly, unmistakably. Frank had pulled the bag from his own jacket. It didn't matter what the crowd believed. It didn't matter what Jasmine said or how composed she remained. He knew the truth. And now he stood on the edge of a decision that would define not just this moment, but his entire life. Speak up and risk everything. Stay silent and become complicit in a lie that would break an innocent woman's life. The air felt thick. The lights still flashed. Frank turned back to the crowd, holding the bag higher. "Under the seat," he said confidently. "Clear as day." Another one who thought she was untouchable. His words landed like a gavel, but Daniel knew it was a lie dressed in uniform. His fingers clenched at his sides, his body locked between 2 forces, truth and fear. Then Jasmine looked at him. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't move toward him, but her eyes locked on his with quiet force, like they could pin him to the pavement. She didn't blink. She just stared, into him, through him. Her voice dropped low enough that only he could hear. "You saw it." It wasn't a question. It was the kind of truth that couldn't be unspoken. Her gaze didn't flinch. Her jaw was tight, but her voice stayed steady, deliberate. "And now you have to decide. Will you let this happen? Will you stay silent? She didn't need to beg. She didn't plead for justice. She just held him accountable. And that was worse, because she knew what this was. She knew how it could end. But she wasn't going to carry his silence for him. Daniel felt his chest tighten, the pressure in his ribcage building like a dam about to break. His training, his loyalty, his fear, his future. They all crashed into each other at once. Jasmine hadn't taken a step back. She stood her ground with dignity. Even now, after being humiliated, accused, and framed, she held more grace than the man who'd orchestrated the whole thing. Daniel looked at Frank, still playing to the crowd, still pretending he'd uncovered something, still selling the lie. And then, without hesitation, Frank escalated the lie into spectacle. He turned to face the growing crowd, holding the plastic bag aloft like it was some kind of twisted trophy. The glare of the setting sun caught the bag just right, white powder glittering faintly under the fading light, making it look more dramatic, more incriminating. "Ladies and gentlemen," Frank called out, his voice rising above the quiet hum of murmurs and phone cameras clicking on. "Looks like we've got ourselves a felony narcotic situation here." His tone was loud, smug, and performative. The crowd shifted instantly. Some gasped, others exchanged glances. A few people stepped closer, phones raised, eyes wide. The words drugs and black woman had just been strung together in public by a uniformed officer, and that combination carried a weight older than any law book. Jasmine stood still, shoulders squared, watching it unfold like a movie she'd been forced to watch too many times before. She didn't move, didn't plead, because this wasn't about guilt or innocence anymore. This was about narrative, and Frank had seized control of it. He turned back toward her with mock disappointment layered over thinly veiled triumph. "You should have just come clean," he said loudly, voice made for the cameras. "Would have saved us all some time." The crowd responded like a live studio audience, some shaking their heads, others whispering too loudly to be private. One woman muttered, "Knew something was off the second I saw that car." A man nearby said, "They always act innocent till they're caught." Phones kept recording, feeding the lie to the algorithm. Jasmine's eyes didn't leave Frank's face. Not once. But behind her stillness was a storm. She was watching every move, every gesture, burning it into memory. She didn't flinch, even when Frank stepped closer, still clutching the bag. His voice lowered slightly, meant only for her this time. "This'll stick," he said. "Doesn't matter who you are." Jasmine's gaze hardened. Her chin lifted just slightly, the only sign of resistance she allowed herself in that moment. And still, she didn't blink, because she knew his performance wasn't just for the crowd, it was to break her, publicly, permanently. But just as Frank tried to deliver the final blow, Jasmine struck back, with truth sharper than any accusation. She didn't flinch. She didn't shout. While the crowd murmured and the phones captured their digital verdicts, Jasmine slowly, deliberately reached into the inner pocket of her blazer. Her movements were precise, not hesitant, but intentional, calm like the eye of a storm. Daniel instinctively took a half step forward, unsure of what was happening, but Jasmine remained composed, her every motion radiating control. Frank's eyes narrowed, one hand inching toward his holster, mistaking her poise for threat. But Jasmine moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. She pulled out a slim, dark leather badge wallet, nothing flashy, but stamped with a golden seal that caught the light like a spark in dry grass. With a single flick of her thumb, she opened it, holding it up at chest level so that both Frank and every camera phone could see clearly. And then, with a voice steady enough to silence the wind, she said the words that detonated the moment. "My name is Jasmine Crockett," she declared, locking eyes with Frank. "Senior advisor to the President of the United States." Frank didn't move. His body was rigid, his eyes locked onto that golden presidential seal like it was something radioactive. The smug confidence that had carried him moments earlier drained from his face, leaving only a pale, brittle man standing in the center of a lie too big to outrun. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came, not even a breath of denial. He had nothing, nothing that could explain away what he had just done. The uniform no longer looked like protection. It looked like a costume, a mask torn off too late. Daniel stood a foot behind him, his mind still trying to keep up with what his eyes had already accepted. The mentor he thought he respected had committed a felony, and not against a stranger, but against a woman of integrity, power, and restraint. Someone who had done everything right and still ended up targeted because of what she looked like, not what she did. Then the crowd cracked open. People shouted, pointed, cried out in disbelief. "He framed her," someone screamed. "That's a federal official," another gasped. Phones lifted higher, the whispers turned to outrage, and the outrage turned to noise. And amid the chaos, Jasmine's voice sliced through like the ring of a gavel. "Officer Daniel," she said, her tone unwavering, her gaze locked onto him with unshakable precision. "You saw what happened. Tell the truth." It wasn't loud, it wasn't desperate, but it carried more weight than anything else Daniel had ever heard in his life. It wasn't just a call for justice, it was a call for courage. She wasn't begging him to save her. She was demanding that he save himself. From the lie, from complicity, from the cowardice that grows when good people stand still. Daniel's heart pounded so hard it almost drowned out the crowd. His mind split between two futures. One where he stayed silent, kept his job, earned Frank's approval, and hated himself forever. Or one where he spoke, risked everything, and finally lived up to the badge on his chest. He could feel Frank's eyes burning into the side of his face. That silent threat. You speak, you're finished. That look that every rookie feared. But Jasmine was still watching. She didn't blink. She didn't break. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Daniel realized neither would he. He took a breath. It wasn't steady. His hands trembled. His voice cracked on the first word. But he didn't stop. "Lieutenant Wallace," he began, the words falling from his lips like bricks, each one heavier than the last. I saw him take the bag from his jacket." Gasps. The crowd went dead silent. "He bent into the car and placed it under the seat. It didn't come from her bag. It didn't come from the car." He looked up, eyes darting between Jasmine and the crowd. "It wasn't hers." Frank took a half step forward. "You don't know what you're saying," he growled. But Daniel didn't flinch. "I know exactly what I'm saying." Daniel cut in, louder now, stronger. "And so do you. You tried to frame her." The crowd erupted again. A woman sobbed. A man shouted, "You're done, Wallace." A dozen cameras zoomed in. Others called out in support of Daniel, their shock now layered with something deeper. Relief. Relief that someone had finally spoken the truth out loud. Frank's face twisted with rage, but his posture faltered. He looked at Daniel like he couldn't believe the betrayal, but it wasn't betrayal. It was integrity, finally refusing to look away. Jasmine's expression softened, not with gratitude, but with solemn respect. She nodded once, slow and purposeful. She had known this moment would come. She just didn't know who would be brave enough to carry it. And Daniel, he had never felt more terrified, or more free. Because the worst part wasn't what Frank had done, it was how close Daniel had come to letting it happen. But not anymore. Not now, not in front of her, not in front of the crowd, and not in front of himself. And as Daniel's voice sliced through the silence, the final wall of denial collapsed. The truth was no longer a murmur. It was a thunderclap, echoing in the eyes of the crowd, vibrating through every phone still held high. Jasmine stood tall, unmoved by the storm around her. But inside, she understood the fragility of moments like this. Truth didn't change systems overnight, but accountability, spoken out loud and witnessed by many, was a fire that couldn't be put out once it started. She turned fully toward Frank. The man who minutes ago tried to humiliate her now stood exposed, his lie crumbling under its own weight. His jaw clenched, eyes darting between Jasmine and Daniel, looking for anything to hold on to. But there was nothing left, no policy to cite, no excuse that wouldn't sound like the desperate flailing of a man who had finally run out of room to hide. "Lieutenant Wallace," Jasmine said, her voice clear, unwavering, and loud enough for the entire street to hear, "you are relieved of duty, effective immediately." The words landed like a gavel slamming against granite. The crowd gasped. Some cheered. Others fell silent in awe. Frank blinked, frozen for half a second, as if he hadn't fully processed what she said. Then his body tensed, and the anger poured through his voice like oil igniting. "You have no idea what I've sacrificed," he barked, stepping forward, eyes blazing. "I've kept this city safe. I've done what had to be done to keep order." His face flushed, veins bulging in his neck as he reached to rip the badge from his chest, gripping it so tightly his knuckles went white. "You think you're going to stand here and judge me? I've worn this badge since before you knew how to tie a tie." Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She took a slow, controlled step forward, closing the space between them until there was no mistaking who was in control now. "There is no order in planting evidence," she said coldly, voice like glass slicing through flesh. "There is no protection in targeting the innocent. You didn't keep the city safe today, Lieutenant. You poisoned it." Her words cut deeper than any weapon. Frank opened his mouth again, but she raised her hand, not to silence him, but to end it. "Hand over your firearm and badge," she ordered, "right now." There was no shouting, no struggle, just the weight of truth pressing down on Frank's shoulders like a mountain. He looked around and realized no one was stepping in for him. Not this time. Not after what they'd all seen. Slowly, almost as if it pained him more than any injury ever had, he reached to unclip his sidearm. The metal groaned in its holster as he passed it over, followed by the badge he once wore like armor. Now it felt like an indictment. Jasmine accepted both items with steady hands. She didn't smile. She didn't smirk. There was no victory in this moment, only gravity. "You chose fear over fairness," she said softly, but with weight that settled over the crowd. "Power without principle is a weapon, and today you used it like one." Frank stood there, breathing heavily, red-faced and deflated. The man who thought he was untouchable was now nothing more than a cautionary tale standing in full view of a community he was supposed to serve. And the community was watching, not just him, but everything. How he responded, how Jasmine carried herself, how Daniel, trembling but resolved, had chosen truth. And above it all, there was Jasmine, still, steady, resolute, not just defending herself, but sending a message to everyone watching. This is what accountability looks like. This is what justice sounds like. And as Daniel's words echoed through the street, the weight of the truth shifted. Now it was time for consequences. Jasmine stepped forward, her expression carved from stone, her presence radiating authority like the eye of a storm. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Every camera was on her. Every breath of the crowd seemed to pause, waiting for what would come next. She faced Frank head-on, her tone sharp, precise, and unmistakably final. "Lieutenant Wallace," she said, voice unwavering, "you are hereby relieved of duty, effective immediately." Gasps spread like fire through the crowd. "Hand over your weapon and badge." Her words weren't a request. They were an execution of accountability. For a moment, Frank didn't move. The silence stretched too long. Then his face contorted, first with confusion, then outrage. "You can't do this," he snapped, fists clenched at his sides, voice rising like a man realizing the walls were finally closing in. "I've served this city for 20 damn years. I've kept these streets clean." He yanked his badge from his chest and held it up like a trophy, voice trembling with rage. "Everything I did was to maintain order." Jasmine's eyes narrowed. She took one step closer, unflinching, calm in the face of his unraveling. "There is no order," she said, her voice like cold steel, "built on lies and prejudice." The crowd murmured, some in stunned silence, others cheering softly. Frank's shoulders rose as if preparing to fight, but there was no fight left to win. Jasmine didn't back down. "You didn't protect anyone today," she continued. "You tried to destroy a life, and you did it with a smile. That's not service. That's power abused." Her words weren't just meant for Frank. They were for every officer watching, for every phone recording, for every citizen who had ever wondered if speaking out would matter. And in that moment, it did. And as Frank finally stepped back, disarmed, disgraced, and dismissed, the crowd stood in stunned silence, waiting for someone to make sense of what they just witnessed. The flashing lights of new patrol cars reflected off windshields and windows, but no siren could drown the magnitude of this moment. Jasmine Crockett stood at the center of it all, her poise unshaken, her voice needed. Officers arrived on scene, but none dared interrupt her. They knew this wasn't just a police matter anymore. It had become national. Journalists pushed forward, microphones outstretched, cameras rolling, questions fired like bullets. "Ma'am, what's your official response? Do you intend to press charges? Is the White House aware of the incident?" Jasmine took a breath, then stepped up to one of the microphones, brushing a lock of hair from her face with the same hand that had held her badge minutes earlier. Her voice, when it came, was not cold, not defensive. It was human, deeply grounded, measured, but there was steel beneath it. "Today," she began, "I did not act as a senior advisor to the President of the United States." Her eyes scanned the crowd, camera lights reflecting off her pupils like fire. "Today, I acted as a private citizen, a woman, a Black American, and a person who demanded nothing more than to be treated fairly under the law." Gasps and murmurs passed through the audience, not of shock, but of resonance. Her words weren't just truth. They were a reflection of so many unheard voices. She continued, her tone never wavering. "I wasn't speeding. I didn't run a light. I complied. I showed my hands. I answered questions. And still I was stopped, humiliated, and accused. Because of how I looked, not what I did. That should terrify every American who believes in justice." Behind her, Daniel Tran stood in silence. But his silence now carried weight, not fear. His eyes, once heavy with doubt, now held clarity. There was something in the way he looked at Jasmine, like he was seeing the job for the first time through the right lens. He'd worn the badge. Now he understood what it meant to earn it. Jasmine turned slightly toward him, offering a subtle but powerful nod. Then she faced the cameras again, this time her words coming from somewhere deeper, not from her title, but from her lived experience. "Today, a police officer tried to plant evidence on me. He abused his badge, his authority, and the trust this country placed in him. And had there been no cameras, no witnesses, no brave officer willing to tell the truth, I might have been just another headline." She paused. The crowd was silent. Even the wind seemed to stop to listen. But this didn't happen in the shadows. It happened on record, on camera, in public. So now we have a choice. Will we look away, or will we face it and fix it? The silence shattered into applause, not the polite, hesitant kind. This was thunderous, raw, earned. Some in the crowd wiped tears, others raised fists. Many simply clapped until their hands turned red. They weren't just applauding a speech, they were applauding courage, truth, and the fact that, for once, someone stood their ground and didn't flinch. Daniel felt the knot in his chest loosen, just a bit. His fingers unclenched, his pulse slowed. For months he had walked a line between the ideals of the academy and the realities of the street. But today he had crossed that line and stepped into integrity. He looked down at the badge pinned to his chest. For the first time, it didn't feel like something he was borrowing. It felt like something he had finally earned. As Jasmine stepped away from the microphones, a young reporter near the front turned to the camera with urgency. "Breaking now in Lexington, Kentucky," she said, voice tight with emotion. "A senior White House official has just been cleared of false drug charges after a junior officer exposed a fellow cop for planting evidence." The story's already trending nationwide, with civil rights groups calling for swift prosecution and reform. The footage began streaming across platforms in real time. Clips of Jasmine's words were shared, reposted, stitched, subtitled. Her face, calm, composed, powerful, filled screens across the country. The message wasn't just about her, it was about the millions who saw themselves in her. The mothers, fathers, children, veterans, professionals, anyone who'd ever been stopped, questioned, or profiled for no reason at all. Within an hour, hashtags flooded social media. Number I stand with Jasmine, number justice in Lexington, number badge and truth. From the corner of the sidewalk, a young girl held her phone to her chest and whispered to her mother, "She's like a superhero." Her mother nodded slowly, eyes still glistening with emotion. "No," she said, "she's something harder. She's real. And Jasmine? She didn't bask in it. She didn't pose. She turned to Daniel, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. You did the right thing, she said. That's where change begins. One truth at a time. He nodded, eyes glassy but steady. I almost didn't, he admitted. But you did, she replied. And that's what matters. They stood side by side, not as hero and witness, not as official and officer, but as equals in the face of a broken system, choosing not to be broken by it. And somewhere, deep beneath the concrete of Lexington streets, the seeds of something new had just been planted. Not because power had spoken, but because power had been held accountable by truth, by courage, and by the refusal to back down. And as Jasmine and Daniel disappeared into the backdrop of sirens and applause, the ripple they had created became a tidal wave. It began with a single clip. 30 seconds of cell phone footage uploaded by a bystander named Alicia Vega. No captions, no edits. Just raw, unfiltered truth. Jasmine Crockett, standing tall, voice calm, revealing her identity to a disbelieving world. Within minutes, the video passed 1 million views. By the first hour, it was climbing into trending territory. But that was only the beginning. Footage from 5, 10, 20 different angles began surfacing, each showing new layers of the confrontation. Daniel's trembling voice as he stepped forward. Frank's face contorted in denial. The moment Jasmine said, I'm not here as an advisor, I'm here as a citizen. It was more than a soundbite. It was a statement carved in stone. Local news stations cut into scheduled programming. Lexington's WKYT aired an emergency panel with legal experts dissecting the possible charges facing Frank Wallace. By 8 p.m. Eastern, national media had descended like vultures and protectors all at once. CNN branded the footage one of the clearest, most public displays of police corruption in recent memory. MSNBC called it a moment of moral clarity. Meanwhile, social media erupted. On Twitter, #Y Stand with Jasmine held the top trending spot in under 2 hours, followed by #Daniel Did Right and #Lexington Truth. On Instagram, activists, lawyers, and celebrities began reposting Jasmine's calm face, her badge in one hand, the microphone in the other. Millions were moved, not just by what happened, but by the way Jasmine held herself under fire, like a lighthouse standing firm in a storm designed to sink her. TikTok took it to another level. Creators added voiceovers, explained the law behind what happened, created timelines, recreated the scene, praised Daniel's courage and Jasmine's restraint. One creator dubbed it the moment that cracked the silence. Comment sections filled with people sharing their own stories. This happened to my brother, but no one believed him. I was stopped, searched, and no one had a camera. She's speaking for all of us. The collective outcry wasn't chaotic. It was focused, fierce, fueled by clarity, and the public wasn't asking for awareness anymore. They were demanding consequences. Back in D.C., the White House could no longer afford silence. Just after 9:15 p.m., the official White House press pool received an internal statement marked priority. By 9:42, reporters filled the Brady briefing room. Cameras flashed. A hush fell as the press secretary walked to the podium, papers in hand, face set in measured gravity. She looked out across the sea of lenses, then spoke. Good evening. Tonight, the president has been made fully aware of the incident involving senior advisor Jasmine Crockett and the Lexington Police Department. She paused, letting the words settle. We want to be crystal clear. This administration does not tolerate the misuse of power, racial profiling, or the betrayal of public trust. Not in Lexington, not anywhere. There was no defensiveness, no vague generalities, only precise accountability. Ms. Crockett's role within the administration is irrelevant in this context. She could have been anyone, any citizen, and what happened would still be unacceptable. But the fact that she is a federal advisor, stopped, searched, and falsely accused in full public view only underlines what many Americans have long known, but rarely seen acknowledged in this way. The room remained silent. No interruptions, no grandstanding. For once, the message wasn't political, it was human. The president has instructed the Department of Justice to launch a formal, independent investigation. The FBI has been notified. Transparency will be total. We owe that not just to Ms. Crockett, but to every American who's ever wondered if they'd be believed when the system failed them. A beat passed before the press secretary added one final line, unwritten, off script. Tonight, we are not just addressing an incident, we are confronting a wound. It was the soundbite that would lead every news broadcast from coast to coast, and while the White House statement rippled across airwaves, it was the Department of Justice that delivered the first real thunderclap. Within hours of the press briefing, unmarked black SUVs rolled into Lexington. Federal agents from the Civil Rights Division and Internal Affairs Task Force began coordinating with state prosecutors. This wasn't a courtesy visit. It was a full-blown, no-holds-barred inquiry. What had once been a local scandal had officially become a federal matter, with national eyes locked on every step. The focus, initially centered on Lieutenant Frank Wallace, widened quickly. Investigators requested decades of internal misconduct files, HR records, and complaint logs from the Lexington Police Department. And what they found was damning. More than 24 complaints had been filed against Wallace over the last 10 years. None had ever resulted in disciplinary action. Not one. His name appeared repeatedly in use of force reports, questionable traffic stops, and missing body cam footage logs. And it didn't stop with him. Federal analysts connected a troubling pattern within the entire unit Wallace operated in, an elite patrol group informally known as Echo Sector. Among them were officers with spotless external records, but suspiciously consistent internal complaints, all quietly dismissed by supervisors who now found themselves under investigation as well. One federal investigator was overheard saying, "We're not just dealing with a few bad apples. This is a poisoned orchard with a forged inspection report." Subpoenas were issued. Former officers, some retired, some pushed out, began to speak. One whistleblower described a culture of organized silence, where officers were trained not just in firearms and tactics, but in how to write reports that could survive legal scrutiny, even when the truth had to be bent to fit. Files long thought shredded or buried began resurfacing. An old civil case from 2017, previously thrown out due to lack of evidence, was reopened. It became clear Jasmine's case had blown the lock off a vault full of ghosts. Meanwhile, Lexington itself was being rewritten in real time. Within days, the city transformed into a civic pressure cooker. Town hall meetings, once sparsely attended, were now overflowing. People stood in the aisles, waited outside, watched on mobile phones through cracked windows. Local churches opened their doors to organize community strategy sessions. Civic groups printed flyers titled "We Knew." Now what? Community organizers didn't just demand accountability. They laid out blueprints. They weren't burning down the system. They were redesigning it, brick by brick. State senators and city council members who had once cautiously tiptoed around the subject of police reform now stood at podiums, openly backing civilian oversight boards, body cam mandates, and independent review panels. A former judge called for a full forensic audit of Lexington PD's last 15 years. A group of local teachers created a program for students to learn their rights during police encounters, funded not by the state, but by grassroots donations. And under every podium, every chant, every press release was the same truth. This change only started because one woman refused to stay silent. But the center of that movement, Jasmine Crockett, refused to step away from the fire. In the days that followed the incident, advisors in Washington urged her to return. Her legal team recommended rest. Her inner circle, worried about her safety, proposed protective relocation until things cooled down. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She stood in front of the Lexington City Courthouse, wearing the same navy blue suit she'd worn during the stop, and addressed the public again. "I've been offered a plane ticket and a press-safe recovery period," she said, her voice steady, amplified by only a single handheld mic. "But I don't need a break. I need the city to know that I'm not leaving." She paused. The crowd held its breath. Cameras rolled. You can't rebuild trust from a distance. You rebuild it from where it was broken. You show up. You listen. You stand in the rubble with the people who were expected to just live in it. "I didn't come to Lexington to survive a scandal. I came to stay until it's better." Applause erupted. louder than before, no longer just supportive, but transformational. It wasn't admiration anymore. It was alignment. That same day, Jasmine met with the acting police chief behind closed doors. What was scheduled as a 20-minute courtesy conversation stretched to nearly 2 hours. Reports later confirmed she requested direct access to training program materials, internal discipline records, and oversight mechanisms. One source said she opened the meeting by saying, "I'm not here to embarrass you. I'm here to fix what you lost sight of." Jasmine worked nonstop. No motorcade, no entourage, just quiet determination. She visited schools. She sat in community centers with grieving parents who had lost children to silence. She attended roll call meetings at precincts where young officers avoided eye contact, unsure whether to salute her or fear her. She held space for them all. "I'm not anti-police," she told one room full of young cadets, "but I am anti-corruption, and if that offends you, check your reflection, not your badge." Across the country, people were watching, not just the investigation, but her response to it. She didn't lash out. She didn't politicize. She didn't weaponize the moment. She channeled it into something dangerous to every broken system, accountability with a face and a voice. And in that quiet resistance, she was doing something no federal investigator could mandate. No speechwriter could script. She was making justice feel possible again. One precinct, one truth, one city at a time. And as Frank finally stepped back, disarmed, disgraced, and dismissed, the crowd stood in stunned silence, waiting for someone to make sense of what they'd just witnessed. The flashing lights of new patrol cars reflected off windshields and windows, but no siren could drown the magnitude of this moment. Jasmine Crockett stood at the center of it all, her poise unshaken, her voice needed. Officers arrived on scene, but none dared interrupt her. They knew this wasn't just a police matter anymore. It had become national. Journalists pushed forward, microphones outstretched, cameras rolling, questions fired like bullets. "Ma'am, what's your official response? Do you intend to press charges? Is the White House aware of the incident?" Jasmine took a breath, then stepped up to one of the microphones, brushing a lock of hair from her face with the same hand that had held her badge minutes earlier. Her voice when it came was not cold, not defensive. It was human, deeply grounded, measured, but there was steel beneath it. "Today," she began, "I did not act as a senior advisor to the President of the United States." Her eyes scanned the crowd, camera lights reflecting off her pupils like fire. "Today, I acted as a private citizen, a woman, a Black American, and a person who demanded nothing more than to be treated fairly under the law." Gasps and murmurs passed through the audience, not of shock, but of resonance. Her words weren't just truth. They were a reflection of so many unheard voices. She continued, her tone never wavering. "I wasn't speeding. I didn't run a light. I complied. I showed my hands. I answered questions. And still, I was stopped, humiliated, and accused because of how I looked, not what I did. That should terrify every American who believes in justice." Behind her, Daniel Tran stood in silence. But his silence now carried weight, not fear. His eyes, once heavy with doubt, now held clarity. There was something in the way he looked at Jasmine, like he was seeing the job for the first time through the right lens. He'd worn the badge. Now he understood what it meant to earn it. Jasmine turned slightly toward him, offering a subtle but powerful nod. Then she faced the cameras again, this time her words coming from somewhere deeper, not from her title, but from her lived experience. "Today, a police officer tried to plant evidence on me. He abused his badge, his authority, and the trust this country placed in him. And had there been no cameras, no witnesses, no brave officer willing to tell the truth, I might have been just another headline." She paused. The crowd was silent. Even the wind seemed to stop to listen. But this didn't happen in the shadows. It happened on record, on camera, in public. So now we have a choice. Will we look away, or will we face it and fix it? The silence shattered into applause. Not the polite, hesitant kind. This was thunderous, raw, earned. Some in the crowd wiped tears. Others raised fists. Many simply clapped until their hands turned red. They weren't just applauding a speech. They were applauding courage, truth, and the fact that, for once, someone stood their ground and didn't flinch. Daniel felt the knot in his chest loosen, just a bit, his fingers unclenched. His pulse slowed. For months, he had walked a line between the ideals of the academy and the realities of the street. But today, he had crossed that line and stepped into integrity. He looked down at the badge pinned to his chest. For the first time, it didn't feel like something he was borrowing. It felt like something he had finally earned. As Jasmine stepped away from the microphones, a young reporter near the front turned to the camera with urgency. "Breaking now in Lexington, Kentucky," she said, voice tight with emotion. "A senior White House official has just been cleared of false drug charges after a junior officer exposed a fellow cop for planting evidence. The story is already trending nationwide, with civil rights groups calling for swift prosecution and reform." The footage began streaming across platforms in real time. Clips of Jasmine's words were shared, reposted, stitched, subtitled. Her face, calm, composed, powerful, filled screens across the country. The message wasn't just about her, it was about the millions who saw themselves in her. The mothers, fathers, children, veterans, professionals, anyone who'd ever been stopped, questioned, or profiled for no reason at all. Within an hour, hashtags flooded social media. Number I stand with Jasmine, number justice. In Lexington, number badge and truth. From the corner of the sidewalk, a young girl held her phone to her chest and whispered to her mother, "She's like a superhero." Her mother nodded slowly, eyes still glistening with emotion. "No," she said. "She's something harder. She's real." And Jasmine? She didn't bask in it. She didn't pose. She turned to Daniel, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. "You did the right thing," she said. "That's where change begins, one truth at a time." He nodded, eyes glassy but steady. "I almost didn't," he admitted. "But you did," she replied. "And that's what matters." They stood side by side, not as hero and witness, not as official and officer, but as equals in the face of a broken system, choosing not to be broken by it. And somewhere, deep beneath the concrete of Lexington streets, the seeds of something new had just been planted. Not because power had spoken, but because power had been held accountable. By truth, by courage, and by the refusal to back down. But as national attention grew and Jasmine held the front line, Daniel was summoned to face a quieter, colder battle. One fought not on camera, but behind closed doors. The internal hearing room at precinct headquarters was small, windowless, and deliberately sterile. Daniel sat across from a semicircle of senior officers, their uniforms crisp, their expressions unreadable. A long table separated them like a wall. No press, no cameras, just Daniel, a recorder, and the silent weight of expectation pressing down like a ceiling about to crack. One of the captains leaned forward, lacing his fingers. "Officer Tran," he said flatly, "while your actions may have received public praise, there's growing concern about your method." Daniel raised his eyes, unsure where this was going. "You bypassed protocol. You aired department matters to the public. You broke rank. That is not how we handle internal conflict." Another senior officer chimed in, voice sharper, tone bordering on disgust. "What you did out there may have felt righteous, but it set a dangerous precedent. You just lit a match under this entire department." Daniel didn't blink. He leaned forward slowly, voice steady. "If the whole department fears one match of truth, then maybe it needs to burn before it can be rebuilt." The room went silent, not because they were shocked by his words, but because deep down, many of them knew he was right. Still, tension crackled. A third officer, a grizzled sergeant near retirement, muttered under his breath, "This job used to mean something." Daniel replied without missing a beat. "It still can, but not if we keep protecting the lie." When the meeting adjourned, no verdict was given, just cold nods and clipped thank yous. Daniel walked out feeling like he'd been put on a silent watch list. But as he made his way through the locker room, something unexpected happened. A younger officer, barely out of field training, stepped out from behind a row of lockers and said quietly, "We've seen things too. Stuff that didn't sit right. We just didn't know we were allowed to say it out loud." Another rookie nodded. You gave people like us a way forward. It wasn't a revolution, not yet, but it was a crack, a fracture, and light was starting to leak through. Outside the building, the air was brisk. Daniel stood for a moment, staring up at the sky. He knew things wouldn't get easier. He'd face retaliation, suspicion, maybe even reassignment. But something inside him felt solid now, grounded. For the first time since pinning on the badge, he wasn't carrying it for others. He was carrying it for himself, and for the people who never had the chance to speak. And in that quiet moment, far from the crowd, he made a promise to himself. This won't be the last truth I speak. And while Daniel stood taller in the shadow of hard-earned truth, Jasmine was just beginning her most public battle yet. Not as a survivor, but as a reformer. Weeks after the Lexington incident, Jasmine was invited to speak at the National Forum on Criminal Justice Reform in Washington, D.C. An invitation extended to her, not as a political appointee, but as a symbol. She stepped onto the stage of the packed convention hall in a simple navy dress, no podium between her and the audience. In front of her were lawmakers, policy advisors, state attorneys general, and hundreds of law enforcement leaders. But Jasmine didn't speak like a politician. She spoke like someone who had bled for the truth. That day in Lexington, she began, I wasn't protected by my badge or my title. I was protected because someone, just one person, had the courage to say, this is wrong. That's what saved me. Not power, not privilege, a decision. The room was still, no coughing, no fidgeting, just breath held in suspense. So I ask you, she continued, voice sharper now, what kind of system do we have if justice relies on chance? What if there hadn't been a camera? What if Daniel hadn't spoken? What if I wasn't Jasmine Crockett? Would I be here today? Or would I be a file gathering dust in some evidence room? By the time she stepped off stage, the room erupted, not in applause but in action. Within days, the Department of Justice confirmed a joint initiative to review outdated training protocols nationwide. Jasmine was offered a seat at the design table. She accepted on one condition: Daniel Tran would join her. Together, they co-founded a task force to create a new training model, the Ethics and Enforcement Curriculum. It was unlike anything ever introduced into federal training programs. Instead of solely focusing on tactics and compliance, their curriculum drilled into character. Bias awareness, moral reasoning under pressure, whistleblower protections, scenario-based simulations, and historical case studies. Every module included real footage, including Jasmine's own stop, as required material. It forced recruits to confront the question, what would you have done? Daniel, still a uniformed officer, stood in front of classes of new cadets and told them about the moment his world split in two. I had to choose between a brotherhood and the truth, he'd say, voice steady. I chose the truth, and I sleep at night because of it. Their model was soon adopted as a pilot program in 7 states, then 12. Within a year, it became the federal standard for all incoming officers under DOJ jurisdiction. Meanwhile, the fallout in Lexington continued to cascade. A sweeping internal audit, triggered by Jasmine's case and sustained by DOJ pressure, exposed years of misconduct buried under red tape. A total of 18 officers, including 2 captains and a former internal affairs director, were either fired, suspended, or placed under federal investigation. A class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of over 40 citizens whose complaints had been ignored or dismissed. Some cases were reopened. Others resulted in settlements. But more importantly, public trust, once shattered, began to form again. Not through promises, but through action. Jasmine didn't disappear after that. She kept showing up. She attended town halls and community forums. She sat through painful testimonies from families whose loved ones didn't have Daniel standing beside them. She didn't offer comfort. She offered transparency. I can't promise the system won't fail again, she told a grieving mother in one forum. But I can promise we're building a system that's harder to corrupt and easier to fix when it cracks. Her presence wasn't just symbolic, it was stabilizing. And then, in what felt like a full-circle moment, Jasmine and Daniel's story caught the attention of the entertainment world. A team of independent filmmakers, moved by the rawness of what had transpired, pitched a concept to Netflix. Not a dramatization, not a fictionalized version, a documentary told through body cam footage, interviews, courtroom clips, and journal entries. It would be called Under the Badge. The title came from something Jasmine said during a closed-door panel. The badge isn't what protects you, it's what hides them, if we let it. Netflix picked it up immediately. The trailer alone racked up 11 million views in its first 24 hours. It featured Daniel staring down the lens, voice cracking as he said, "I almost stayed quiet. I almost let it happen, but I didn't. And that's the only reason we're telling this story instead of burying it." The film premiered in select cities and was released globally within weeks. It sparked national dialogue. Police academies hosted internal screenings. Churches, universities, and even corporate HR departments streamed it in workshops. The hashtag number sign under the badge flooded timelines, along with photos of people holding up blank ID cards with the caption, "Even if I wasn't someone, I should still be protected." And amid it all, Jasmine kept going. She declined job offers. She turned down book deals. She refused to be turned into a brand. "This isn't a comeback story," she told one interviewer. "This is a system story, and systems take time to fix." From a roadside injustice to a national reckoning, Jasmine Crockett and Daniel Tran became unlikely architects of reform. Not because they were perfect, but because they were willing to bleed for the truth in public when it mattered most. They didn't seek power. They used their pain to reshape it. And as the country watched, something rare happened. People believed again. Not in the system itself, but in the people brave enough to demand it be better. And as the final credits of Under the Badge rolled across millions of screens, the real work, the enduring work, was only just beginning. Months later, at a newly restructured police academy in Louisville, Kentucky, a soft buzz filled the main lecture hall. 40 young cadets dressed in crisp uniforms and stiff collars sat in quiet anticipation. Some were fresh out of college. Others were former military. A few had seen what injustice looked like up close in their own neighborhoods. But all of them shared one thing. They were about to be trained in a system rebuilt from fire and truth. Jasmine stood behind the glass wall overlooking the room, arms crossed, her gaze fixed on them, not with scrutiny, but with hope. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence alone carried history, both a warning and a promise. These cadets didn't just know her name. They knew her story. They had studied it. They had debated it. They had been shaped by it. And now they were part of the legacy that followed it. Then the classroom door opened. Daniel Tran stepped in quietly, his stride steady, his eyes sharper than ever. Gone was the uncertainty that once shadowed his every move. He carried a slim binder under one arm, its cover stark white, the title printed in bold, no-nonsense type, "How We Rebuild Trust." He placed it gently on the lectern and looked up. The room fell silent. "I'm not here to teach you how to follow orders," he said, voice calm but resolute. "I'm here to show you what it takes to stand when you're the only one who sees the line being crossed." He glanced toward the glass wall. Jasmine was still there, watching, nodding once. "And if we get this right," Daniel continued, "you won't need a camera to prove you did the right thing. Your choices will speak for themselves." Outside, the sky shifted from gray to gold. And inside that academy, a new chapter quietly began, one written not in silence, but in truth spoken early, boldly, and without regret. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. A federal judge screamed like a madman, pointing and ordering the arrest of attorney Jasmine Crockett right in the middle of the courtroom. But less than 2 minutes later, it was he who was in handcuffs, as the FBI stormed in before hundreds of stunned witnesses. Jasmine didn't shout. She didn't argue. She simply placed a sealed envelope on the table, and the entire network of power began to collapse. So what was inside that envelope? Powerful enough to bring down a judge who thought he was the law? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The morning was overcast, the sky stained a dull gray, and the marble halls of the federal courthouse echoed with the kind of silence that warned people not to speak unless spoken to. Inside courtroom 4B, the temperature was fixed, literally and metaphorically. Judge Ronald Beckett had a standing order, 67 degrees, not a fraction higher. At exactly 8:52 a.m., he noticed the thermostat reading 69. He didn't just frown, he erupted. "Drop it to 67. Now!" he snapped at the bailiff as if issuing a military command. He didn't wait for acknowledgement. He never did. To him, the courtroom wasn't a chamber of justice. It was a throne room, and everyone else was a servant. Beckett was notorious, not just for his rulings, but for the way he ran his court like a dictatorship. He berated his clerks for minor mistakes, once threatening to fire one mid-session because her typing sounded nervous. He'd personally ordered the removal of veterans, mothers, and quiet observers from the gallery simply for wearing political pins he didn't like. And while no formal charges had ever stuck, whispers of bias tailed him like a shadow, especially after 3 separate federal complaints were mysteriously sealed without explanation. In his eyes, conservative wasn't a political view, it was a red flag. Attorneys with family values, faith-based arguments, or community ties often found themselves buried beneath technicalities. That morning, Beckett expected more of the same. A quiet railroad to conviction, a defendant barely defended, a lawyer too scared to push back. But then a nervous voice from the clerk's bench whispered the name that broke his rhythm. "Your Honor, the defense counsel is Jasmine Crockett." Beckett's face didn't change immediately, but his fingers gripped the bench a little tighter. His jaw locked ever so slightly. He blinked twice, slow and deliberate. He'd heard that name before, and he didn't like what it meant. Not one bit. The courtroom doors opened, and Jasmine Crockett walked in, not with swagger, but with certainty. A former congressional attorney, she had grilled defense contractors in closed-door hearings and once dismantled a high-ranking official with nothing but a binder and a calm voice. Across the room sat her client, Eleanor Haynes, a retired nurse who had spent 20 years running a shelter for homeless women. Now she stood accused of financial fraud based on vague accounting and missing documents no one could explain. Beckett leaned back in his chair, a slow smirk creeping across his face as his eyes locked on Jasmine like a hunter sizing up his prey. His tone was cold, theatrical, laced with mockery that filled the room like a bad smell. "So, this is who they sent?" he scoffed. "Another so-called activist in a suit, thinking a law degree and a few buzzwords make her the voice of justice." His voice sharpened. "What's next? Are you going to read us a Bible verse and call it a closing argument?" Then he leaned forward, his voice dropping low, but loud enough for every word to sting. "Let me tell you something, Ms. Crockett. I've seen your type. Black lawyers who walk in here like they're above the rules, full of attitude, full of ego, thinking the court owes them respect just for showing up. They all think they're different." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "But in this courtroom, they all end up learning the same thing. This is not their world." The silence that followed wasn't just heavy, it was suffocating. Jasmine didn't react. She didn't shift in her chair or glance at the gallery. She simply leaned forward, opened her briefcase, and retrieved a slim black binder. Unassuming on the outside, but inside, evidence with teeth. She walked to the center of the courtroom, heels steady against the cold marble floor, and placed the binder firmly on the evidence table. No theatrics, no emotion, just clarity. "Your Honor," she began, her voice level but commanding, "this is a full record of the Eleanor Haynes Foundation's financial activity over the past 24 months. All donations, withdrawals, and vendor payments, each one verified, time-stamped, and traceable." She opened the binder to the first section. 3 neatly printed bank statements, each accompanied by notarized certification, lay before the court like loaded rounds. "These funds were raised legally," she continued, flipping the page, "deposited directly from donors, individuals, churches, and one local union. Every single cent accounted for." She tapped one entry with the back of her pen. "This donation here, $10,000, was questioned by the prosecution. But as you'll see, the receipt from both the bank and the donor are included, with IRS compliance forms attached. She turned another page. No shell accounts, no foreign transfers, no misappropriation. This is a woman who spent her retirement helping others and now stands accused on paperwork that's mysteriously incomplete. She looked at Beckett then, not with anger, but with the unshakable confidence of someone who has done the work. There is no fraud here, she repeated slowly, only a narrative built on assumption, not fact. She stepped back. The silence in the room was thick, charged. The documents lay there in full view, waiting, unshakable, verified, undeniable. And just like that, Jasmine had shifted the courtroom's balance, not by raising her voice, but by raising the standard for truth. The silence hadn't lasted 5 seconds before the prosecution lunged. Matthew Langley, a career federal prosecutor known more for securing convictions than seeking the truth, stood with the swagger of someone who'd never heard the word no in a courtroom. Polished, political, and fiercely loyal to the bench, Langley had built his reputation on crushing defenses before they could even breathe. "Objection!" he snapped, already on his feet, his voice tight, performative, like he had been waiting for this exact moment. "These documents were never submitted during the discovery process. Your Honor, this is a flagrant violation of protocol." His finger pointed toward the binder like it was a weapon. "Defense is introducing new evidence outside the required timeline. This is trial by ambush." Several heads in the gallery turned toward Jasmine, confusion flickering across their faces. But Beckett didn't even blink. He sat forward slowly, as if enjoying the shift in energy, then delivered his line with icy satisfaction. "Well, well, so much for transparency, Ms. Crockett." He tapped his gavel once, lightly, more for effect than order, before continuing. "This is exactly what I expected when I saw your name on the docket. A late-game stunt, hoping no one would challenge you." He folded his hands, eyes narrowing. "You deliberately withheld these documents, and now you expect the court to treat them as legitimate? That's not bold. That's deceitful." He glanced toward the prosecutor and smirked. "Looks like we'll have to clean this up before it taints the record." Every word landed like a slap, not because it was loud, but because it was systemic, practiced, rehearsed. Jasmine had followed every rule, submitted every form, yet the moment the evidence turned the tide, the rules bent against her. The message was clear. In this room, power didn't fear facts. It rewrote the frame around them. And right now, the frame was being built to bury her. But what he underestimated was that Jasmine Crockett didn't walk into court with emotion. She walked in with receipts. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She simply reached into her folder and slid out a single page. Clean, sharp-edged, protected in a plastic sleeve. The kind of page that meant business. The kind no one could argue was hearsay. She stepped forward, held it up for the room to see, then calmly approached the bench. "Your Honor, this is a certified court receipt," she said, "stamped on March 15th, signed by a clerk in your own office." She laid it down with care, directly in front of Beckett. "It confirms that the financial documents in question were submitted, processed, and logged, on time, through official channels." She turned the page toward him so he couldn't avoid reading it. The red court seal gleamed under the lights. A signature, elegant but rushed, sat at the bottom. There was even a timestamp, 2:41 p.m. "This isn't just a copy," she added, her voice still level, but firmer now. "This is the original acknowledgement of discovery compliance. This document didn't appear today. It's been sitting in your system for 3 weeks." The room was silent. No one moved. Even the prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. Jasmine let that silence grow. Let it sink in. "So either the court lost it," she said, eyes fixed on Beckett, "or someone deliberately acted like it never existed." It wasn't defiance in her tone. It was truth, and that made it more dangerous than any outburst. The receipt had left a crack in the wall Beckett had spent years building around his authority, and Jasmine had just driven a wedge right into it. Judge Beckett stared at the stamped document on his bench like it had personally insulted him. For a moment, he didn't move. Then, without a word, he pushed it aside with the back of his hand, sharply, as if contact with it made his skin crawl. "This doesn't change a thing," he snapped. "In my courtroom, I decide what's legitimate. I decide what's admissible. Not some binder full of paper you throw at me last minute. His voice rose as he spoke, pitch tightening, volume climbing, not from confidence, but from something closer to panic. I don't care what date is stamped on it. If I say it's inadmissible, it's inadmissible. That's how it works here. His gavel hand twitched, hovering over the block like a reflex he couldn't control. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She turned one page in her binder with slow, steady precision and lifted her voice, just enough for every word to land. Federal Rule of Evidence 902 subsection 11, she began. A record of regularly conducted activity is self-authenticating if accompanied by a written declaration from the custodian, submitted prior to trial. She looked up directly at Beckett. This document meets every condition, and the court's own records confirm it. Beckett leaned forward now, eyes narrowed, lips curling into something between a sneer and a warning. You're quoting statute to me? He said, voice low and cutting. You think coming in here with your law school textbook and some printed-out rules gives you authority? He laughed once. Short, bitter, almost hollow. You've got nerve, I'll give you that. But don't think for 1 second you're going to lecture me on how this courtroom operates. Then louder, harsher, I am the law here. The room fell into a heavy silence. Even the prosecutor looked away. And Jasmine, still standing, still calm, let the weight of his outburst settle before saying anything at all. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't change her tone. She simply said, with respect, Your Honor, the law exists whether you acknowledge it or not. For the first time that morning, the power in the room shifted. The shift wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. Beckett leaned back slightly, his face unreadable, yet his grip on control no longer felt absolute. Jasmine saw it, and that was when she moved. She took a breath, calm but deliberate, and reached into her briefcase. Not for a statute, not for a motion, but for a small sealed envelope marked Exhibit E. Since the court is now focused on timelines and proper process, she said evenly, the defense respectfully submits material relevant to judicial conduct prior to this hearing. Her tone never changed, but the words shifted the air in the room. She opened the envelope slowly and removed 3 items: a printed photo, a restaurant receipt, and a page of GPS logs. She held up the first photo. This still frame is taken from a motion-activated camera in the lower garage of the Liberty Federal Building. It shows Judge Beckett entering a black SUV at exactly 11:47 p.m. last night. She handed it to the bailiff, then turned the second page toward the bench. This is a transaction record from Brennan's Steakhouse, time-stamped 12:31 a.m. It includes 3 entrees, 2 bottles of Lafite Rothschild, and no credit card, paid in cash. A low stir ran through the courtroom gallery. She didn't pause. At that table were 3 men, Judge Beckett, Prosecutor Matthew Langley, and Mr. Don Callahan, a registered lobbyist currently under federal investigation in 2 districts for improper influence on sealed judicial decisions. Gasps now. Even the stenographer hesitated, hands hovering above the keys. Jasmine continued, her voice steady. Finally, this third document is a location report from Mr. Langley's government-issued phone. It shows movement from the federal lot at 11:43 p.m. to the steakhouse, where it remained stationary until 12:42 a.m. She laid the papers down carefully, aligning each with quiet precision. No security detail, no transparency, just a private, undocumented meeting between the judge, the prosecutor, and a man whose name shouldn't appear within 100 yards of this courtroom. She stepped back, and yet, here we are. The truth had been laid bare, not just in ink and timestamps, but in the shift of the room itself. For Judge Ronald Beckett, this wasn't just a challenge to his authority. It was an earthquake shaking the very floor beneath his bench. Beckett's eyes jumped from the documents to Jasmine and back again, as if blinking would make them disappear. His mouth opened, but for a moment, nothing came out. Then, his voice sharp and cracking like a whip too frayed at the tip. Bailiff, now! The gavel slammed once. Remove her from this courtroom, immediately. She is in contempt, obstructing the integrity of these proceedings. His voice grew louder, more erratic. This is my courtroom, and she will not stand here accusing me of Of the sentence broke in half, the words lost in a throat tightening with panic. He tried again. She has overstepped. She's turning this trial into a circus. Get her out of here. He stood up now, his black robe billowing slightly as he pushed himself back from the bench. He jabbed a finger in Jasmine's direction, not like a judge enforcing order, but like a man drowning, reaching for someone to pull down with him. You will be removed by force if necessary, he threatened. This is your last warning. But force never came. The bailiffs remained by the door, motionless. Their eyes didn't move toward Jasmine. They didn't even look at Beckett. One of them stood rigid, his jaw clenched. The other blinked once, then let out the faintest breath, like he'd been holding it too long. Their silence wasn't laziness. It wasn't defiance. It was clarity. They knew. They'd seen the photos, the GPS logs, the timestamp receipts. They had heard Jasmine's voice, measured, lawful, surgical, and they had watched Beckett crack open like a rotten shell. Still no one moved. Beckett turned to them now, voice shrieking louder. Are you deaf? Did you not hear the order I gave? His face flushed deep red, his eyes wide, almost frantic. This woman is interfering with justice. If you don't act now, you'll be next. Do you understand me? But even as the words spilled out, the room had already stopped believing them. The gallery was no longer afraid. A ripple of murmurs spread across the rows, some leaning in, some covering their mouths, others whispering names like Callahan, Langley, Brennan's Steakhouse. The air felt dense, electric, as if something massive had just been detonated, but the shock wave hadn't reached the walls yet. And through it all, Jasmine stood completely still. She hadn't spoken since the last exhibit. Her hands rested calmly at her sides. Her binder lay closed on the table. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't taken a step. She simply waited like a clock counting down the seconds to something inevitable. Because it was. The clerk had stopped typing. The prosecutor had gone pale. The room had gone still. Judge Ronald Beckett, once the unquestioned voice of that courtroom, stood shouting into a void that no longer echoed him back. His words hit the walls and died there. The robe still hung from his shoulders. The gavel still rested on his bench. But in the eyes of that room, he no longer sat above anyone. And in that deafening silence, the reality settled. He had shouted, he had ordered, he had threatened, and no one had moved. She turned slowly, calmly, like someone who knew she was no longer speaking to just a courtroom, but to history. From the inner flap of her case, she pulled out a thick white envelope, sealed, crisp, and marked with the unmistakable red insignia of the Office of the Inspector General of the United States Department of Justice. The weight of it wasn't in the paper, but in what it represented. Jasmine didn't wave it. She didn't announce it with flair. She walked it forward with both hands, like a surgeon handling a sealed diagnosis, and laid it down at the evidence table with deliberate care. Face up, seal visible, unopened. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. For the record, she began, each word clear and grounded. This envelope contains an official letter of investigation initiated by the Office of the Inspector General. She paused, not for drama, but to let the weight of those words settle. It outlines a formal federal inquiry into patterns of judicial misconduct originating in this courtroom, under the authority of Judge Ronald Beckett. A rustle moved through the gallery. Jasmine didn't flinch. The contents include documentation of more than a dozen rulings, flagged by independent ethics monitors, including sealed verdicts, retroactive document suppression, and failure to disclose relevant financial connections. She tapped the envelope once, softly. It also details evidence that led to the decision, surveillance footage, financial logs, communication records, and sworn witness accounts, all of which connect Judge Beckett to decisions influenced by private meetings and undisclosed relationships with individuals under federal scrutiny. She let that hang in the air. This is not a defense tactic, she added quietly. It's a federal procedure, signed, dated, and approved for immediate review. She stepped back, eyes steady, posture unshaken. In accordance with federal protocol, a copy of this notice has already been transmitted to the Department of Justice and the Administrative Office of U.S. Courts. No one in the room spoke, not even Langley, not even the gallery, because now it wasn't just Jasmine's word against the bench. It was the entire system pulling back the curtain. Beckett's complexion paled beneath the courtroom lights, faint trace of sweat now visible at his temple. He glanced at the envelope again, as if hoping it would vanish, then looked up, first at Jasmine, then at the gallery, and finally at the two silent bailiffs still standing frozen by the door. His voice came low at first, shaky, almost cracked. This is absurd, he muttered, then louder, trying to gather strength. This entire presentation is a smear campaign against the bench. I am a sitting Article 3 judge, appointed for life. I have full judicial immunity. You know what that means, Ms. Crockett. I can't be prosecuted for decisions made in the course of my duties. You can't just put me on trial because you don't like my rulings. He was speaking faster now, not with confidence, but desperation disguised as authority. This investigation is unconstitutional. It undermines the separation of powers. I acted under the law. I followed my discretion. That's what judges are meant to do. He slammed his palm on the bench again, but this time it didn't echo. It just thudded, hollow. Whatever accusations you're trying to make fall under protected action. That's not corruption. That's the job. But Jasmine didn't move. She didn't raise her voice or flinch at his escalation. She simply waited until he finished, then stepped forward with a measured calm that pierced through every frantic word he had just spilled. Judicial immunity, she said, clear and slow, is not a license to betray the public trust. Her tone wasn't cold. It was focused. It exists to protect judges who make honest decisions, even unpopular ones. But what it does not protect is the abuse of that bench for personal gain. She took another step forward, her voice still quiet, but impossibly firm. You didn't just make rulings. You buried evidence. You sealed outcomes without cause. You held closed-door meetings with prosecutors and lobbyists, then ruled in their favor the next day. She turned her gaze directly into his. That's not discretion. That's collusion. That's not protected. It's punishable. Then she added quieter now, as if speaking to the entire room. Immunity ends where corruption begins. The silence that followed was no longer stunned. It was convicted. Every person in that courtroom, from the gallery to the clerk to the motionless security, knew what had just happened. The law had finally stood taller than the man in the robe. Without looking away from the bench, Jasmine turned back to her table, flipped open her binder, and pulled out a small, labeled flash drive. It was no bigger than a thumb, but in that courtroom, it might as well have been a grenade. She walked it calmly to the bailiff and said, her voice clear and composed, "This is Exhibit D, a certified audio recording taken inside Judge Beckett's private chambers on March 22nd, just 1 week after the Haynes case was first logged into the court system." The courtroom was completely still. You could hear the faint hum of the ceiling vents. Jasmine continued, not for drama, but for clarity. It is the voice of Judge Beckett giving explicit instructions to his court clerk to remove digital files related to this case from the official system. She looked directly at the young woman seated just feet from Beckett. And it will show that this deletion was not a mistake. It was a direct order. The clerk froze, her hands tightening around the edge of her notepad. She didn't look up, not yet, but her posture had changed, shoulders drawn in, breathing unsteady. As the bailiff connected the flash drive to the court system and tapped the playback button, the room seemed to hold its breath. Then, his voice, clear, confident, cold. "That file doesn't go anywhere. I don't want to see it logged. I don't want it referenced. It disappears. Do you understand? If it stays, the case gets thrown out. I'm not going to let that happen." Gasps rippled across the gallery, but the audio kept playing. "I've protected you, haven't I? You want to keep working here, right? Then don't ask questions. Just make it go away." The clerk's hand flew to her mouth. She closed her eyes tightly, but the tears came anyway. She tried to hold them back, tried to stay small, but something inside her broke. Slowly, painfully, she stood up, her voice shaking as she looked at no one in particular. "He told me if I didn't delete the file, I'd never work again," she said, barely above a whisper. He said he'd ruin my name in every court from here to Baltimore, that no one would believe me if I spoke up. I didn't want to lose everything, so I did it. I erased the file. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. Some spectators looked down. Others stared at the clerk in disbelief. Even the stenographer hesitated, eyes wide, unsure whether to keep typing or just listen. Jasmine didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She simply looked at the clerk, and in that glance was something rare in that courtroom. Compassion. The recording had played. The tears had fallen. The truth had landed like a hammer on the bench. And in the space between guilt and silence, Judge Beckett broke. His hand slammed against the wooden bench so hard the gavel jumped. His voice exploded from his throat, loud, hoarse, desperate. I am the law. The words echoed off the marble walls, but no one answered. He rose to his feet, chest heaving, eyes wild with something that wasn't fury anymore. It was fear, dressed up in rage. This courtroom exists because of men like me, he roared, pointing into the crowd as if daring them to challenge him. I've kept this system upright when everyone else wanted to burn it down. I don't answer to you. I don't answer to her. I answer to the Constitution. But his fingers shook as he waved it. His voice cracked again. He was sweating now, lips pale, hands trembling as he reached again for the gavel, his final symbol of control. When he grabbed it, he squeezed too hard. It slipped. It hit the floor with a hollow clatter. No one moved to pick it up. Beckett's eyes darted around the room, scanning faces that had once looked at him with deference. Now they watched him like a stranger. The clerk, still seated, had gone silent, her face streaked with tears. Langley stared at the floor. Even the bailiffs, men who once jumped at his slightest command, stood still as statues, unmoved. The gallery was frozen, a packed room of people suddenly aware they were witnessing the exact moment when power ran out of places to hide. His breathing grew shallow, his shoulders sagged, and though he was still speaking, muttering now, quieter, no one was listening, because the moment had passed. The robe, the bench, the title, they were all still there. But the authority behind them had vanished. There was no dignity left in the way he stood. The silence in the courtroom stretched long enough to feel permanent. Beckett stood exposed, voice gone, power drained, and robe hanging like a costume no one believed in anymore. But what came next wasn't silence. It was justice with a badge and a warrant. At precisely 11:32 a.m., the heavy courtroom doors swung open, not with force, but with purpose. No shouted announcement, no rattling threats. Just the measured, coordinated entry of 6 federal agents in dark suits, their presence more thunderous than any raised voice. The lead agent stepped forward, calm and deliberate, his badge already out, his voice crisp and low, but echoing across the wooden chamber like a verdict that had been waiting too long to be delivered. Judge Ronald Beckett, he said, tone emotionless, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, destruction of evidence, and conspiracy to commit judicial fraud under Title 18, Section 1503. No one in the room gasped. No one needed to. They had already felt this coming, like a slow-moving storm that finally broke open above their heads. The only sound was the distinct click of handcuffs being unclipped from a duty belt. Beckett flinched. For a moment, he didn't move. Then he exploded. You can't do this, he shouted, recoiling from the agents like they were reaching for his skin. I'm a federal judge. I have lifetime appointment. I have protections. He backed up against the bench, his arms flailing wildly, knocking over his own water glass in the process. This is a setup. I have friends in Congress. Do you hear me? Powerful people. His voice cracked again, turning into something ragged. You think you can walk into my courtroom and put me in cuffs like some street thug? You're making a mistake. A huge one. The lead agent didn't blink. Sir, do not resist. But Beckett did. He tried to shove past one of the younger agents, stumbling off the dais, the hem of his robe tangling around his shoes. You'll all regret this, he barked, spittle flying. I've got people in Washington who will bury this whole circus. I'll have your badges, every single one of you. 2 agents stepped forward, calm but unflinching. One took his right arm, the other moved to block his escape. Beckett jerked back and twisted, trying to rip free, but his strength was gone. All that remained was noise. The lead agent gave a final warning. "You are resisting a federal arrest. Stand down now." Beckett froze, chest heaving, eyes darting, sweat pouring down the side of his face. And in that exact moment, he seemed to realize this wasn't bluster anymore. This was the end of the illusion, of the game, of the untouchable robe that once protected him from consequences. And that understanding, the real, sinking, soul-deep understanding, hit him harder than any handcuff ever could. Then came the metallic click. The cuffs locked tight around his wrists. No applause, no cheers, just silence. Beckett stood there for a moment longer, trembling, his arms pinned behind him. He didn't look at the agents. He didn't look at the gallery. He looked at her. Jasmine Crockett hadn't moved. She stood exactly where she had all morning, beside the defense table, back straight, expression steady. Not triumphant, not vengeful, just true. As Beckett was turned to face her, cuffed and breathing hard, their eyes locked for the last time. "You!" he spat. "You did this!" Jasmine tilted her head slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't raise it, didn't project, but somehow it was the only sound that mattered. "No," she said. "You did this to yourself a long time ago." Then she added, her words like frost, soft and surgical. "I just turned on the light." He blinked, once, then again. There was nothing else to say. The agents turned him around and led him slowly toward the back of the courtroom. The cuffs rattled slightly as he walked. A sound far smaller than his gavel, yet far more final. As they passed the gallery, no one whispered. No one dared, because the truth had taken its place in that courtroom and refused to leave. Behind the agents, the trail of Beckett's fall was unmistakable. A bench left vacant, a clerk still quietly weeping, a prosecutor who couldn't meet anyone's eyes, and a sealed envelope still sitting on the evidence table, untouched. And Jasmine? She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply turned, reached for her binder, and closed it with a quiet snap. Her job, at least in that room, was finished, but her work was just beginning. As Beckett was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, the air hung heavy, not just with the weight of justice finally delivered, but with the knowledge that this was only the beginning. Jasmine hadn't just exposed one man. She had pulled the thread that would unravel an entire hidden network. At 11:33 a.m., barely 60 seconds after the arrest in Washington, D.C., a near simultaneous ripple of federal action was already unfolding across the country. 7 states, 7 courthouses. 7 black-robed men who, like Beckett, had once believed they were beyond consequence. And now each of them faced the same truth he did. No robe is thick enough to cover corruption forever. In a quiet federal courthouse in Austin, Texas, Judge Carl L. Monroe was halfway through sentencing when the side doors opened and 4 FBI agents entered, flanking both aisles. The courtroom froze. Before he could even gavel for order, one agent stepped forward and announced the arrest. Obstruction of justice, falsification of court records, and participation in coordinated judicial tampering. Monroe's jaw dropped, but no words came. The cuffs clicked a moment later. In Detroit, Judge Stanley Rourke was preparing to recess for lunch. His staff had already noticed something was off. His phone kept buzzing, but he hadn't touched it. At 11:34 a.m., agents arrived at his chambers, presented the warrant, and led him out through the same hallway he once had defendants march down in shackles. Reporters were already waiting outside. The headline would write itself. In Miami, in a courtroom wrapped in sunlight and marble, Judge Michael Esperanza, once considered untouchable, was pulled from the bench mid-trial. The gallery gasped as he shouted, "You can't be serious! This is Florida!" But the agents didn't flinch. "Yes, sir. We're very serious." The microphone was still on. The entire courtroom heard it. By 11:36 a.m., the pattern had repeated itself in Seattle, in Chicago, in Atlanta. Each judge arrested, each warrant executed based on digital evidence, sealed communications, and surveillance footage recovered over months of secret investigation. Every man believed to be a pillar of the judiciary, now exposed as a piece of a coordinated machine built to protect influence and punish dissent. In Phoenix, Judge Horace Neely collapsed into his chair when the agents read the charges. He didn't argue. He didn't scream. He just asked, "How long have you known?" The answer, "Long enough," hung in the air as two agents helped him to his feet. Back in Washington, news alerts had already begun lighting up phones across the gallery. One reporter gasped aloud as she read the breaking headline, "Federal judges arrested in coast-to-coast operation tied to Beckett corruption probe." Cameras outside the D.C. courthouse were now turning away from Beckett's motorcade and scrambling to cover the unfolding national drama. But inside the courtroom, Jasmine Crockett didn't look surprised. She stood near the bench, eyes steady, watching the ripple play out exactly as it had been designed. She had warned them. This was never about one courtroom, one defendant, or even one verdict. This was about a system, and now, piece by piece, that system was being forced to look in the mirror. Each judge had been part of closed-door sessions with Beckett, some in person, others masked as conference calls, codenamed judicial alignment meetings buried in administrative calendars. But the files recovered from Beckett's personal devices, including encrypted transcripts, GPS logs, and anonymized transfers, had painted the full picture. Decisions weren't being made based on law, but on influence. Cases weren't ruled on, they were managed. The Office of the Inspector General had been building the case for months, quietly compiling every signal, every whisper, every late-night rendezvous logged through parking garage surveillance and untraceable burner phones. And now it was over. 7 judges. 7 men who had once silenced attorneys, blocked evidence, and smiled from the bench like kings behind glass. Each now booked, fingerprinted, and handed over to U.S. Marshals for processing. Their robes would never be worn again. In the back of the D.C. courtroom, one of the younger interns watching it all unfold whispered to herself, "This is history." And it was. Because for the first time in years, those who had bent justice to serve themselves weren't just being challenged, they were being removed. And Jasmine Crockett? She didn't take a victory lap. She didn't grandstand. She just stood there, binder closed, knowing that this moment, this ripple that had turned into a wave, would reach places even she hadn't seen yet. Justice hadn't just arrived, it had struck all at once, as 7 judges were led out in handcuffs across the country, as headlines screamed of the implosion of a once untouchable network. The woman whose name started it all sat quietly at the defense table, wrinkled hands folded in her lap, eyes glassy with exhaustion. Eleanor Haynes didn't look like a threat to the system, but her case had just helped bring it down. The courtroom was different now. The heat of tension had cooled. The storm had passed, leaving behind only truth and cleanup. Beckett's bench sat empty, his chair abandoned like a throne stripped of power. In his place stood a newly appointed interim judge, brought in at dawn under emergency protocol. He didn't speak much. He didn't have to. The moment he stepped into that courtroom, everything had changed. Eleanor sat upright, back straighter than it had been all morning. Her hands, once trembling when she first entered under a suspicion of fraud, now gripped each other with quiet dignity. Jasmine sat beside her, flipping open the same binder she had used to dismantle Beckett's defense, and then closed it again without needing to turn a single page. The real evidence had already spoken. The new judge cleared his throat. After thorough review of the defense exhibits, bank records, certified filings, and supporting declarations, this court finds no credible basis for the charges brought against Ms. Eleanor Haynes. His voice was calm, but final. All accusations of financial misconduct are hereby dismissed with prejudice. This case is closed. There was no applause, no outbursts. Just that soundless moment when justice finally feels like oxygen returning to a suffocating room. Eleanor didn't cry. Not yet. She simply let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for months. One hand rose to her chest, fingers brushing the modest silver cross she wore on a necklace beneath her collar. Jasmine put a hand gently on her shoulder. No words were exchanged. There didn't need to be any. A clerk typed the dismissal into the record. The sound of keystrokes suddenly felt like music. But the impact of that verdict would reach far beyond the courtroom walls. 3 hours later, Eleanor stepped out onto the courthouse steps, and the world was waiting. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder, cameras rolling, microphones extending like spears. Questions were already flying about the judges, the scandal, the fallout. But then the doors opened and all eyes turned. Eleanor Haynes didn't step out like a woman rescued. She stepped out like a woman returned. She wore the same blue sweater she'd worn when she was first arrested, the one that had been shown in newspapers next to headlines about charity fraud and misuse of donations. But this time, she didn't look like someone on trial. This time, she looked like someone who had survived the fire and walked out carrying the truth. A few reporters shouted questions. "Ms. Haynes, what would you say to those who doubted you?" Another, "Will you sue the government for wrongful prosecution?" A third, "How did it feel knowing a federal judge tried to destroy your life?" Eleanor didn't speak at first. She looked up at the sky for a moment. Then she turned to the crowd and simply said, "I forgive them." Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear enough to silence every camera. Because the people who needed shelter didn't stop needing it just because I was in court. We've got work to do. That's where I'm going. And with that, she walked past the microphones, down the stairs and into a world that was finally ready to see her again. By the end of the week, the foundation Eleanor had started, the one she was falsely accused of stealing from, had received more than $600,000 in donations from supporters across the country. Messages poured in from churches, shelters, even retired veterans who remembered her name from 20 years ago. The headlines changed overnight, from falsely accused to fearless, the return of Eleanor Haynes. Judge falls, but she stands. Local TV stations visited the shelter she had opened nearly a decade earlier, where volunteers had hung a banner that read, "Welcome home, Miss Ellie." She didn't do interviews. She didn't sit down for press conferences. She went back to work, helping women find beds, food, and warmth. Jasmine visited once, quietly to drop off a check and a hug. Eleanor told her, "You didn't just save me. You saved all the people I haven't met yet." And it was true, because in the wake of Beckett's downfall, dozens of sealed cases were reopened. Victims who had been railroaded under closed-door rulings were offered retrials. Attorneys began speaking more freely. Whistleblowers who had stayed quiet for years came forward. The echo of Eleanor's trial didn't stop at her acquittal. It opened the floodgates. 1 month later, the Department of Justice formally exonerated Eleanor Haynes. Her record was wiped clean. Her foundation was cleared of all investigation. And in a quiet letter delivered to her home, the Office of the Inspector General included one handwritten line beneath the official stamp. "Sometimes justice takes longer than it should. Thank you for not giving up." She framed it, not for herself, but for the women she served, because Eleanor had never needed a courtroom to prove who she was. But now, finally, the world knew it too. She didn't hold a press conference. She didn't grant a single interview. And when her name began trending on national news under titles like "The Woman Who Took Down the Bench" or "Jasmine vs. Goliath," she declined every request with the same answer: "There's someone else who needs help." By the following Monday, Jasmine's rental car was halfway down a cracked highway in rural Tennessee, her phone silenced, her blazer traded for jeans and a plain canvas coat. The spotlight was behind her now, where it belonged. Ahead lay a quiet town most people wouldn't stop in, much less think about. But she had read the case file, and that was enough. The man's name was Wallace Carter, a 67-year-old Vietnam veteran who had lived on the same half-acre of land for 34 years. He'd built his house himself, with no mortgage, no loans, just sweat and time. His reward? A surprise eviction notice posted on his door while he was at a VA clinic, followed by a foreclosure judgment from a local court he hadn't even been allowed to speak in. They said he owed back taxes. He had proof he'd paid them. No one ever looked at it. Jasmine parked outside a rusted mailbox marked Carter, Lot 47, and stepped onto the dirt driveway. The house was still standing, but barely. Plastic sheets covered the windows, and an American flag, faded but flying, hung from a pole made of salvaged pipe. Wallace answered the door with a limp and a loaded stare. "Don't need another lawyer," he said before she could speak. "I'm not here to charge you," Jasmine replied. "I'm here because someone took your home away with a rubber stamp, and that rubber stamp's getting reversed." He didn't trust her. Not yet. But he let her in. The living room smelled like dust and history. Old medals hung next to faded photos, boot camp graduation, a young man in uniform beside a woman holding a baby. Jasmine didn't touch anything. She just listened. He told her about the letter from the county, the missed hearing he was never told about, the lawyer who never called back, the judge who refused to admit his documents into evidence because they didn't match the county format. He'd gone to the courthouse 3 times on his own. No one had let him past the front desk. He showed her the paperwork, neatly stacked, yellowing at the corners, but complete. Jasmine reviewed it in silence, her brow furrowed deeper the longer she read. What they did wasn't just illegal, she finally said. It was personal. Someone wanted this land. Wallace nodded once. The man who bought it runs the bank downtown. His nephew sits on the zoning board. You think that's coincidence? I think it's corruption, Jasmine replied, and I've spent the last 6 months taking that apart. The next morning, Jasmine walked into the county courthouse alone. She wore no press badge, no lapel pin, and didn't announce who she was. But she carried Wallace Carter's file under one arm, and under the other, a printed copy of Title 42, U.S. Code Section 1983. The clerk behind the glass window looked confused. Do you have an appointment? No, Jasmine said, smiling slightly. But you have a hearing on record from March 14th, Case 2-297A. I'd like a certified transcript. The clerk frowned. That hearing's sealed. Private foreclosure proceeding. Under which statute? The clerk hesitated. Jasmine didn't. I'll wait right here while you look it up. Or I can file an emergency motion in federal court. Your choice. 10 minutes later, she had the transcript in hand. What followed over the next 48 hours was methodical. Jasmine reviewed every name tied to the decision. The county attorney who had signed off without reading, the bank executive who had bought the land for half its value, the circuit judge who had presided over the case while his own son worked at the same bank. She submitted a motion to vacate the judgment. She included evidence of conflict of interest, judicial bias, and procedural violations. And she sent a courtesy copy to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District. The response came faster than expected. On the third morning, the courthouse door opened again. This time, it wasn't Jasmine who walked through, but a U.S. Marshal and a federal investigator. They carried subpoenas. By noon, the foreclosure judgment was stayed. By the end of the week, Wallace Carter had legal possession of his home again. He didn't throw a party. He didn't post a photo. He just stood on his porch, staring at the dirt he'd fought so long to hold, and finally said, "You didn't even know me. Why did you come?" Jasmine adjusted the strap of her bag, ready to leave. Because when power steals something small, she said, it becomes easier to steal something big. You held the line, Mr. Carter. I just walked it with you. He nodded slowly. They won't come back? Not while I'm watching, she replied, then paused. And I'll be watching. She got into her car and drove away before the sun could set. She didn't post about it, didn't mention it in interviews, because she still wasn't doing interviews. But 2 weeks later, a new name appeared in a footnote of a federal complaint about unlawful property seizures in rural counties. The footnote read, precedent supported in part by Carter Veters Holloway County, vacated 2025, and beside it, one quiet citation, Counsel of Record, Jasmine M. Crockett. Long before Beckett, there was another robe that tried to hide rot beneath its folds. His name was Judge G. Thomas Porteous, a federal judge in Louisiana, appointed in 1994. Like Beckett, he wore his title like armor. And like Beckett, he believed that once he sat on the bench, no one could touch him. He wasn't wrong, at least not for the first 10 years. Porteous didn't fall because he made one mistake. He fell because he made many, repeatedly, shamelessly, and with full confidence that no one would dare to stop him. He took gifts, took envelopes of cash, took expensive meals from lawyers appearing in his court. Then he ruled in their favor, over and over again, all while maintaining the illusion of fairness. The people around him knew. Clerks, attorneys, bailiffs, even prosecutors whispered his name with caution. Everyone felt it. Something wasn't right, but no one spoke. Because in a system built on rank and ritual, silence becomes the currency of survival. And so, for nearly a decade, Judge Porteous sat above the law, not because he was clever, but because the machine protected itself. He wasn't investigated until 2007. He wasn't impeached until 2010. He wasn't removed from office until December 8, 2010, more than 10 years after the first whispers began. His was only the 8th judicial impeachment in U.S. history. But the real number that mattered wasn't 8, it was 10. 10 years of lies, 10 years of silence, 10 years of people knowing and doing nothing. In contrast, what happened with Judge Beckett wasn't just justice, it was speed. Because this time, someone didn't wait. This time, a woman walked into the courtroom and refused to play along. Jasmine Crockett didn't request a panel. She didn't file quietly and wait her turn in the appeals process. She dropped the truth on the record, in real time, in front of cameras, in a room full of people who could no longer pretend they didn't see. That's the difference between systems that rot and systems that fight to heal. Porteous thrived in the darkness. Beckett was exposed under the lights. But the real tragedy? They weren't so different. Both used their power to silence those without it. Both built invisible walls around themselves using fear, procedure, and position. Both knew the rules and used them as weapons. And both could have been stopped much, much sooner. If someone had dared to ask, what if the judge is the problem? The only thing Beckett didn't have that Porteous did was time. Because the world is changing, slowly, brutally, unevenly, but changing. Jasmine Crockett represents that shift. Not a revolution with fire, but a quiet war fought with documents, statutes, and witnesses who can no longer be ignored. Where Porteous went unchecked for a decade, Beckett fell in a matter of weeks because someone refused to let silence win again. But the lesson remains bitter. It took too long. For both. And the cost was borne not by the men in robes, but by the people they were meant to serve. The legacy of men like Thomas Porteous and Ronald Beckett proved one thing. Injustice doesn't just survive in silence, it thrives in it. But sometimes someone walks in, not to burn the system down, but to remind it what it was supposed to be. And in that courtroom, that day, her name was Jasmine Crockett. She didn't wear armor. She didn't carry signs. She didn't raise her voice or pound her fists. She simply walked into the fire with nothing but facts, calm, and the quiet force of someone who knew what it meant to be underestimated. If Rosa Parks challenged power by staying seated, Jasmine Crockett did it by standing tall, in the very room designed to keep people like her silent. In a federal courtroom lined with oak and arrogance, where portraits of dead white men loomed over every motion filed, Jasmine stood like a contradiction, young, black, unshaken, and uninvited. Her very presence disrupted centuries of unspoken hierarchy. She didn't need to shout. Her stillness did the shouting for her. Every time she opened her mouth, she carried history with her, but she didn't preach it. She used it like a scalpel, precise, quiet, unforgiving. She wasn't the first black woman to face that kind of room, but she was one of the few who faced it unapologetically. Like Rosa Parks, she didn't ask for permission to confront injustice. She just refused to move out of its way. And like Rosa, she wasn't trying to make a scene. She was trying to make a point. But here, the seats weren't on a bus. They were on a bench 12 inches above everyone else. And the driver wasn't a conductor. He was a judge with a gavel and no conscience. Still, Jasmine didn't flinch. When Beckett mocked her credentials, her skin, her presence, she didn't flinch. When the prosecutor echoed the smear with a smirk, she didn't flinch. When the gallery full of skeptics waited for her to fall apart, she didn't flinch. Instead, she unfolded her binder. And when she spoke, the courtroom didn't just listen, it shifted. Because there was something dangerous about the way she stood, something powerful about the way she wouldn't shrink. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. Jasmine Crockett refused to surrender her voice. And in a space where voices like hers had been interrupted for generations, hers came through clear and clean. Not because the court allowed it, but because she demanded it. She quoted federal evidence rules not to prove she knew them, but to prove the system had forgotten them. She didn't raise her voice to match Beckett's. She spoke under his, forcing the room to lean in. She turned facts into resistance, procedure into power. And when she dropped that sealed envelope on the table, detailing a federal investigation against the very judge trying to silence her, it was the modern equivalent of Parks refusing to move. A simple act. Calm, director, irreversible. But her revolution didn't come in front of a cheering crowd. It came in front of clerks too afraid to speak, guards too trained to move, and a gallery too stunned to react. It didn't need chance. It didn't need headlines. It needed courage, the kind that doesn't ask what happens next, the kind that stands up anyway. Because Jasmine Crockett didn't come to start a movement. She came to end a lie, and that day she did. Jasmine Crockett never asked for a spotlight. She didn't seek applause or titles. But when the gavel dropped on the last corrupted bench, when the last seal was broken and the truth stood alone, she didn't disappear. She simply moved on. Because for her, justice isn't a moment. It's a habit. And the story she leaves behind isn't about one courtroom. It's about all of us. There's a moment in every fight for truth when the ground beneath your feet goes silent. Not because you've won, but because everything is waiting. For someone to speak, for someone to step forward, for someone to decide the cost of doing nothing is finally too high. That moment came for Eleanor Haynes, for Wallace Carter, and for the courtroom full of people who watched a judge scream, "I am the law," and saw for the first time that he wasn't. But that moment also lives outside the story, in real homes, in real towns, in systems that still believe no one will ever challenge them. It lives in the silent file clerk who knows something is being buried, in the junior lawyer asked to look away, in the whistleblower rehearsing the words but never saying them aloud, in the bystanders, watching, waiting, hoping someone else will go first. This story wasn't just about a corrupt judge. It was about how easy it is for power to rot in the dark, and how rare it is for someone to strike a match. What Jasmine Crockett did wasn't extraordinary because it was dramatic. It was extraordinary because it was so deliberate. She didn't storm the court. She followed the rules. Exactly. She didn't shout over the judge. She quoted him. Precisely. She didn't beg the system to listen. She forced it to look in the mirror. And in doing so, she reminded the country of something most had forgotten. Justice doesn't come when we ask. It comes when we refuse to look away. It's easy to believe the law is unshakable, that once a man sits on the bench, his word becomes gospel. But every page of history says otherwise. Behind every collapsed institution is a string of people who saw the cracks and said nothing. And yet behind every moment of progress is someone who finally said, enough. Jasmine was that someone. But she doesn't wear a cape. She doesn't deliver speeches. She doesn't need to. Because the real weight of justice doesn't live in slogans. It lives in quiet courage. The courage to speak plainly when it would be safer to stay silent. The courage to file the motion, show the receipt, press play on the recording. The courage to stand in a room that wasn't built for you and not back down. This story is a reminder, not just of what's broken, but of what's possible. That a system as vast and tangled as the federal judiciary can still be challenged from the bottom. That a retired nurse can defeat a federal judge. That a veteran can keep his land. That a black woman in a courtroom full of silence can make the truth so loud it becomes undeniable. But most of all, it's a reminder that no matter how high the walls get built, no matter how many robes sit behind them, truth finds a way through. Because injustice is loud, but accountability is louder when someone dares to carry it in their hands. So what is the lesson? It's not just that corruption exists. We already knew that. It's that courage exists too. And sometimes all it takes is one person with a binder, a voice, and the willingness to stand their ground, to remind an entire nation what justice is supposed to look like. And maybe, just maybe, the next time someone sees something wrong, they won't wait for the headlines. They'll start the match, because the darkness doesn't fear the fire. It fears the person who isn't afraid to light it. But a story like this doesn't end in the courtroom. It doesn't fade when the judge is cuffed or the defendant walks free. Because what happened to Eleanor Haynes and what Jasmine Crockett uncovered doesn't live only in fiction. It lives in reality. It lives where you are. And that means the next move is yours. So ask yourself, what would you do if it were your name on that docket? Your mother being smeared by the system? Your neighbor losing his house while no one listens? How many judges like Beckett still sit behind benches, cloaked in power but hiding rot beneath their robes? And how many Jasmines are out there, waiting to speak but unsure if anyone will stand with them? Don't let this be just another story you scroll past. Let it be a line in the sand, because silence protects corruption. But truth needs a voice, and sometimes that voice is yours. If you see injustice, name it. If you hear lies, challenge them. If you know someone who's been silenced, listen, and then help them speak louder. Share this story. Talk about it at your dinner table, in your community, in your courtrooms. Let people know that justice isn't about power. It's about courage. And no matter your job, your background, or your age, you have the power to be the match in a room full of darkness. The system only works when we watch it, not from a distance, but with our eyes open, our feet planted, and our voices ready. This isn't just Jasmine's fight, or Eleanor's, or Wallace's. It's ours. And if you're still listening, that means the story isn't over. It means you're part of what comes next. So be the one who lights the next fire, before someone else is left to face the dark alone. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.